I thought the blizzard would hide me. I thought the silence of the northern wilds would keep me safe. I was wrong. I didn't hear him approach. There were no footsteps crunching on the snow, no warning howl. 1 second, I was alone, and the next, the air in my tiny cabin grew heavy, thick, charged with enough static to make the hair on my arms stand up. I turned around, and my heart stopped. He took up the entire doorway, massive, ancient, a wall of dark leather and muscle blocking out the light. He wasn't looking at the knife in my hand. He wasn't looking at the door I'd failed to lock. He was looking at me. And he wasn't looking at me like an enemy. He was inhaling my scent like it was the first breath of air he had taken in 500 years. He took 1 step forward, and the floorboards groaned under his weight. "Mine," he whispered. And just like that, I knew running was no longer an option. Welcome home, my loves, to Storm's Werewolf Romance Library. If that shiver running down your spine is exactly what you've been looking for, you have found your pack. We're about to settle in for a story about a runaway soul and the king who waited centuries just to find her. Before we let Malachi claim his queen, please take a second to like this video. It helps our library grow. Make sure you are subscribed with the notification bell on so you never miss a chapter of their story. And for those of you who want to support the channel and listen ad-free, check out our channel membership options. I want you to get comfortable for this one. Grab a blanket, grab a tea, and tell me in the comments, are you listening in the dark? Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Exile. The snow in the northern wilds did not simply fall, it erased. For 3 weeks I had watched the world outside my window turn into a blank canvas of white, burying the tree line and the jagged rocks until the landscape looked like a held breath. It was the kind of silence that would have driven a lesser wolf to madness, but for me, it was the first time in my life that the noise in my head had finally stopped. I pressed my palm against the frosted glass of the cabin window, letting the biting cold seep into my skin until my fingers went numb. This abandoned cutter's shack at the edge of the silent pine lineage territory was supposed to be my tomb, a place where a rejected Omega went to fade away into obscurity. Instead, it had become the only sanctuary I had ever known. I turned away from the window and moved toward the small cast-iron stove in the center of the room, wrapping my threadbare cardigan tighter around my ribs. My wolf, usually a chaotic storm of anxiety and submissive instincts, was strangely quiet today. She was not pacing in the back of my mind as she usually did, whining for the safety of a pack that had never wanted us. Instead, she was curled up in the depths of my soul, purring with a vibration that rattled through my bones. It was unnerving. She acted as if she were waiting for something, though I knew there was nothing out here but ice and the ghosts of old legends. I added a log to the dying embers, watching the sparks fly up the chimney. I had enough firewood for another week, maybe 2 if I rationed it, but after that, I would have to face the truth of my situation. I was not surviving. I was simply taking a long time to freeze. My mind drifted back to the moment I ruined everything. The memory was sharp, cutting through the haze of my isolation like a blade. I could still see the great hall of my former pack, the banners hanging from the rafters, and the expectant look on the alpha's face as he offered me his hand. It was supposed to be a gift. I was the runt, the quiet thing in the corner, and he was offering to elevate me. But when I looked at him, I didn't feel the pull of fate or the heat of a bond. I felt nothing but a cold, suffocating dread. I had looked him in the eye and committed the ultimate sin of our kind. I said no. I denied him, not out of arrogance, but because I knew that accepting him would be a death sentence for my soul. The gasp of the court still echoed in my ears, louder than the wind howling outside. I had run before the shock could turn into anger, fleeing north until my paws bled, and the scent of the pack faded into the sharp, clean smell of cedar and coming snow. Now, I was alone, in a territory that was forbidden to outsiders. The silent pine lineage was a myth to most, a pack of ancient reclusive monsters who guarded the northern glacier. Everyone said they were extinct, or at least dormant, sleeping beneath the ice like dragons in a fairy tale. I had counted on that. I had counted on the emptiness of this land to hide me. I moved to the small table where my mug of tea sat cooling, the ceramic chipped at the rim. I took a sip, the bitter liquid doing little to warm the chill that had settled deep in my chest. I was foolish to think I could outrun my nature. Wolves were not meant to be solitary creatures. We withered without connection, our hearts slowly turning to stone until we simply stopped waking up. Perhaps that was what my wolf was doing, preparing to sleep forever. The wind outside changed pitch, dropping from a high, keen shriek to a low, mournful moan that vibrated against the timber walls. My wolf suddenly stood up inside me, her ears pricked forward, her tail giving a slow, heavy thump against my ribs. I froze, the mug halfway to my mouth. The air in the cabin shifted, becoming heavy and charged with static, making the fine hairs on my arms stand up. It wasn't the storm. It was something else. A presence. Vast, ancient, and terrifyingly close. I set the mug down with a trembling hand, my eyes darting to the heavy oak door I had bolted shut hours ago. A knock echoed through the room. It was not the frantic scratching of a lost traveler, or the battering of the wind. It was 3 distinct, heavy thuds. A demand. A rhythmic, authoritative sound that seemed to stop my heart in my chest. I backed away until my hips hit the edge of the stove, the heat searing through my jeans. But I couldn't look away from the wood. No one came this far north. No one survived the wilds in a storm like this. My instinct screamed at me to hide, to crawl under the bed and pray, but my traitorous wolf was pulling me forward. She wanted me to open it. She was desperate for me to open it. I grabbed the iron fire poker from the rack, my knuckles turning white as I gripped the cold metal. I held my breath, waiting for a voice, a growl, anything to explain the intrusion. The knock came again, louder this time, shaking the dust from the rafters. It was the sound of fate coming to collect a debt I didn't know I owed. Chapter 2. The Monster in the Doorway. I should have fled through the back window and taken my chances with the blizzard, but my body refused to obey the frantic signals of my brain. Instead of running, I found my hand reaching out to slide the heavy iron bolt back, the metal biting into my skin with a stinging coldness that grounded me in the moment. My wolf was pushing me, practically shoving my consciousness aside to get to what waited on the other side of the timber, and for the first time in my life, I let her take the lead. The latch gave way with a harsh groan of rusted metal that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. I pulled the door open, bracing myself for the biting wind and the snarling face of a bounty hunter sent to drag me back in chains. The wind did not rush in, and there was no snarl. The storm seemed to break against the figure standing on my threshold, parting around him like water around a stone. He took up the entire frame, his shoulders brushing the wood on either side, a wall of dark leather and raw power that blocked out the swirling white world behind him. He was massive, a mountain carved into the shape of a man, with a face that looked like it had been chiseled from the granite of the cliffs themselves. His hood was pulled low, casting his features in shadow, but I could feel the weight of his gaze hitting me with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't the lecherous, assessing stare I was used to from the males of my old pack, who looked at me and saw only breeding potential. This gaze felt ancient, heavy, and terrifyingly focused, as if he had spent a lifetime searching for a single grain of sand and had finally found it on my welcome mat. He lowered his hood with a slow, deliberate movement, revealing hair the color of midnight and eyes that burned like molten gold in the darkness. My breath hitched in my throat, a sharp, painful sound that seemed to echo in the small space. I knew that face. Every wolf in the north knew the legends of the Firstborn, the creatures who walked the earth before the packs fractured into petty kingdoms. But seeing him in the flesh was a different matter entirely. He was beautiful in the way a forest fire is beautiful, destructive, overwhelming, and impossible to look away from. He stared at me with an intensity that made my knees weak, his golden eyes tracing every inch of my face as if he were memorizing a sacred text. There was no anger in his expression, no malice, only a profound, shattering relief that washed over me in waves, confusing my terror with a sudden, inexplicable warmth. He took a step forward, and the floorboards groaned in protest under his heavy boots. I scrambled backward, the fire poker trembling in my grip, until my back hit the rough wood of the kitchen table. He stepped fully inside, kicking the door shut behind him with a casual strength that sealed us in together. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy with the scent of him, wood smoke, deep earth, and the sharp electric tang of lightning striking dry ground. He unclasped his heavy fur cloak and let it fall to the floor, revealing a black sweater that clung to a torso thick with muscle. He didn't look at the weapon in my hand. He didn't even seem to register it as a threat. His attention was entirely, possessively fixed on my eyes. "Who sent you?" I whispered, my voice cracking under the weight of his presence. I tried to summon the defiance that had driven me to reject Garrick, but it felt thin and brittle in the face of this titan. "If Garrick sent you to drag me back, you should know that I will not go quietly. I would rather freeze in this cabin than return to a cage." He tilted his head, a slow, predatory movement that sent a shiver racing down my spine. A low sound rumbled in his chest, vibrating through the floor and up into the soles of my feet. It wasn't a growl, but it was close. A deep, resonant hum of displeasure at the mere mention of another male's name. He crossed the distance between us in 2 long strides, stopping just out of reach of the iron poker. The heat radiating from him was intoxicating, melting the frost that had clung to my skin for weeks. He looked down at me, his expression softening into something that looked dangerously like adoration. "I answer to no one, little wolf, and certainly not to a boy playing at being a king," he said, his voice a rich baritone that seemed to wrap around me like velvet. He reached out, his hand hovering inches from my face, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his palm, but far enough to give me the choice to pull away. I didn't move. I couldn't. "I did not cross the ice to return you to a prison. I crossed it because the moment you severed your bond, my soul woke up, screaming your name. I am not here to take you back, Thalia. I am here to take you home." Chapter 3. Snowbound. The word home hung in the stagnant air between us, heavy and impossible, echoing with a promise I was too terrified to believe. Before I could stammer out a denial or demand an explanation, the blizzard outside slammed against the cabin with renewed fury, shaking the timber frame until the iron nails groaned in their sockets. The world beyond the frosted glass had vanished completely, swallowed by a white void that sealed us into this tiny, oscillating box of firelight and tension. I gripped the iron fire poker until my knuckles ached, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, as I waited for the violence that experience had taught me always followed a male's arrival. But Malachi did not lunge, and he did not shout. Instead, he turned his back on me with a dismissal that was both arrogant and strangely calming, moving toward the dying stove as if he had lived in this cramped space for a century, rather than 5 minutes. He moved with a grace that belied his massive size, crouching before the cast iron grate to inspect the fading embers I had been rationing so carefully. I watched him, paralyzed by confusion, as he reached for the small pile of wood I had gathered. His hands were enormous, scarred and calloused, yet he handled the split logs with a reverence I couldn't comprehend, stacking them into the firebox with precise, deliberate movements. A spark caught, then a flame, and within moments the stove began to radiate a heat that chased the biting chill from the corners of the room. It was a domestic act, a simple chore of survival, but performed by him, this legendary creature of ice and violence. It felt like a ritual. He was claiming the space not by force, but by providing the one thing I had been unable to secure for myself: warmth. The heat in the room rose, and with it, the scent of him intensified, filling my lungs with the smell of wood smoke, deep earth, and something uniquely masculine that made my head spin. He stood up, the movement fluid and silent, and reached for the hem of his black sweater. My breath hitched, panic flaring in my chest as I raised the poker higher, but he simply pulled the thick wool over his head and tossed it onto the back of the chair. Underneath, he wore a thin undershirt that did nothing to hide the landscape of his body. Muscles corded like steel cables shifted beneath his skin, and silver scars, souvenirs from wars fought before I was born, mapped a history of violence across his arms and shoulders. He was a weapon made of flesh and bone, a creature built for destruction. Yet he was standing in my kitchen in his shirt sleeves, checking the flue of my stove. I realized with a jolt that I was trembling, not from the cold anymore, but from the sheer sensory overload of his presence. He was too big for the room, his head nearly brushing the rough-hewn beams of the ceiling, his broad shoulders blocking the light from the singular lantern. My wolf was practically vibrating with a desire to go to him, to rub her face against his hand. But my human mind remained locked in a cage of fear. I had spent my life making myself small to avoid the wrath of men who viewed my existence as an inconvenience. Malachi was not making me feel small. He was making me feel protected. And that was a sensation so foreign, it felt dangerous. I watched the play of light on his forearms as he adjusted the damper, realizing that he had completely ignored the iron bar I was brandishing like a sword. It was an insult to his strength, a silent declaration that nothing I could do would ever truly threaten him. He turned slowly, his golden eyes finding mine across the small distance of the cabin floor. The intensity of his gaze had not dimmed. If anything, it had grown hotter, burning through my defenses and seeing the terrified, lonely woman hiding beneath the bravado. He looked at the fire poker still raised in my shaking hand, then up to my face, his expression shifting into something unreadable, but deeply, shatteringly intimate. He took a step toward me, and I braced myself, my muscles locking up. But he stopped well outside my striking range. He didn't want to hurt me. He wanted me to understand just how safe I actually was. "You can put the weapon down, little wolf," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards and straight into my chest, bypassing my ears entirely. He held my gaze, his golden eyes filled with a terrifyingly absolute certainty. The only thing in this room at risk of being destroyed is me. Chapter 4. The Feeding. The iron fire poker clattered to the floor, the sound harsh and dissonant against the sudden stillness of the room. It was an act of surrender, not because I was defeated, but because the truth in his voice had dismantled the fear holding my spine straight. Malachi didn't smile in triumph. He simply nodded once, a sharp, decisive dip of his chin, as if my capitulation was an inevitability written in the stars, rather than a choice I had just made. He turned away from me immediately, dismissing the weapon as if it had never existed, and moved toward the small, shadowed corner of the cabin that served as my kitchen. I watched him go, my legs feeling like water, and sank onto the nearest chair, the adrenaline draining out of me to leave a hollow, aching exhaustion in its wake. He opened the cupboard doors, the wood looking fragile in his massive grip. I felt a flush of shame heat my neck as I realized what he would find. A pathetic stash of dried venison, a few withered root vegetables, and a canister of stale tea. It was a pauper's pantry, the hoard of a woman expecting to starve slowly. I expected him to sneer, to comment on how far an omega had fallen, but he said nothing. He simply began to work. The silence stretched, filled only by the sounds of his movements, the rhythmic chop of a knife against the cutting board, the hiss of water hitting a hot pan, the clink of ceramic. It was surreal to watch the Lycan King, a being whose name was used to frighten children into obedience, standing in my tiny kitchenette, chopping carrots with the focus of a master tactician. His sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, exposing the thick cords of muscle in his forearms that shifted and flexed with every slice. He moved with an efficiency that was mesmerizing, transforming my meager scraps into something that smelled rich, savory, and impossibly comforting. The scent of the stew filled the cabin, overriding the smell of dust and cold ash. My stomach betrayed me, letting out a loud, traitorous growl that echoed in the quiet room. I clamped a hand over my midsection, mortified, but Malachi didn't turn around. I saw the muscles in his back shift as he reached for a bowl, ladling the steaming broth with a care that bordered on reverence. He walked toward the table, the bowl cradled in his hands like an offering, and set it down in front of me. The heat radiating from the ceramic warmed my face, but I didn't pick up the spoon. I looked up at him, waiting for him to serve himself, to take the lion's share, as every alpha I had ever known would have done. In my old pack, the omegas ate last, scraping the pots after the warriors had had their fill. It was the law of the hierarchy. The strong took, and the weak were grateful for what remained. But Malachi stood there, empty-handed, his arms crossed over his broad chest as he leaned back against the counter. He wasn't eating. He was watching me. His golden eyes were fixed on my face with an intensity that made the air feel thin, tracking the rise and fall of my chest, the way my tongue darted out to wet my dry lips. I pushed the bowl slightly toward him, a silent invitation, a deeply ingrained instinct to yield to the higher rank. He didn't move. His gaze dropped to the bowl, then snapped back to my eyes, dark and unyielding. He shook his head slowly, a refusal that brooked no argument. He would not eat until I was full. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. He was not asserting dominance by taking. He was asserting it by providing. He was the apex predator, and he had decided that his sole function in this moment was to ensure I survived. I picked up the spoon, my hand trembling slightly. The first mouthful was scalding hot, tasting of salt and earth and care. I hadn't realized how cold I was, how empty I had been, until the warmth hit my stomach. I ate quickly, ungracefully, the desperate hunger taking over. I could feel his eyes on me the entire time, heavy and possessive. He wasn't just watching me eat, he was consuming the sight of it. Every time I swallowed, his nostrils flared, inhaling the scent of my satisfaction. It was the most intimate thing I had ever experienced, far more vulnerable than being naked. I scraped the bottom of the bowl, feeling a strange, heavy heat settle in my belly that had nothing to do with the food. I looked up, breathless, meeting his gaze. He pushed off the counter and took a step toward me, his voice rough, stripped of all pretense. "I have been starving for 500 years, Thalia," he whispered, his eyes dropping to my lips, as if he wanted to taste the broth lingering there. "Watching you eat is the first time I have ever felt full." Chapter 5. The Coldest Night. The lantern on the table sputtered and died, plunging the cabin into a darkness so absolute it felt like a physical weight pressing against my eyes. With the loss of the light came the true assault of the cold. The storm outside had escalated from a howl to a scream, battering the thin timber walls with a violence that made the entire structure shudder. The cast-iron stove, which had been a source of such comfort only an hour ago, was fighting a losing battle against the drafts slicing through the floorboards. I pulled the scratchy wool blanket up to my chin, curling into a tight ball on the narrow cot, but the chill was already seeping into the marrow of my bones. It was the kind of cold that didn't just numb the skin, it slowed the heart, a creeping lethargy that whispered of sleep and never waking up. I stared into the gloom, my breath pluming in white clouds before my face, listening to the sounds of the man who had invaded my sanctuary. Malachi was settling onto the floor near the stove, having refused the bed with a curt shake of his head. I could hear him shifting on the hard wood, the rustle of his leather coat serving as his only mattress. It was a ridiculous gesture of chivalry. He was a king, a creature of immense power and lineage, and he was resigning himself to sleep on a draughty floor like a guard dog, while I took the only raised surface in the room. The guilt gnawed at me, sharper than the frost. He was massive, his frame far too large for the cramped space between the stove and the wall, and I knew the floorboards were freezing. But more than the guilt, it was my own selfish instinct for survival that finally broke the silence. My teeth were beginning to chatter, a humiliating sound that betrayed just how poorly my body was handling the drop in temperature. I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that if I slept alone tonight, I would wake up with frostbite, or I wouldn't wake up at all. "You will freeze down there," I whispered into the dark, my voice trembling uncontrollably. The wind roared outside, swallowing my words, so I tried again, louder this time. "Malachi, the floor, it's ice. You're going to freeze." His voice came from the shadows, low and calm, unbothered by the elements. "I have slept in glaciers, Thalia. A wooden floor is a luxury. Go to sleep." "I can't," I admitted, the truth slipping out before I could stop it. "I'm cold. I can't stop shaking." There was a pause, a heavy silence where I could feel his attention shift from the fire to me. I heard him sit up, the leather of his coat creaking. "Do you want me to add more wood?" "We don't have enough," I said, clutching the blanket tighter. "If we burn it all tonight, we'll have nothing for the morning. Just get up here." The invitation hung in the air, reckless and terrifying. I was inviting a male, a stranger, a predator into my bed. Every lesson I had ever learned about self-preservation screamed that this was a mistake. But my body was screaming louder for warmth. "The bed is small, but it's warmer than the floor. Please." He didn't move immediately. I could feel his hesitation, a tangible resistance in the dark. He was restraining himself, holding back his own instincts to ensure I felt safe. When he finally stood, he moved slowly, giving me ample time to change my mind. The mattress dipped heavily as he sat on the edge, his weight pulling me toward him. He didn't lie down right away. He sat there for a moment, his back to me, a solid wall of heat that radiated through his clothes and washed over my freezing face. It was intoxicating. It was like sitting next to a furnace. Without a word, he kicked off his boots and swung his legs up, lying down on top of the covers. He stayed on the very edge, giving me as much space as the narrow cot would allow, his back turned to me, a rigid line of respect. I didn't stay on my side. I couldn't. The pull of his warmth was magnetic, overriding my fear. I scooted closer until my chest pressed against his back, burying my face in the wool of his sweater. He went completely still, his breath hitching in his lungs. I wrapped an arm tentatively around his waist, anchoring myself to him, stealing his heat with a desperate greed. He was solid as rock, immovable and vast, and for the first time in weeks, the shivering stopped. The cold receded, replaced by a deep, seeping warmth that relaxed muscles I didn't even know I was holding tight. He shifted slightly, just enough to drape his own heavy arm over mine, locking me against him. It wasn't a trap. It was a shield. His hand covered mine, his palm dwarfing my fingers, and his thumb began to stroke the back of my hand in a slow, rhythmic, soothing motion. The storm raged outside, trying to tear the world apart. But in the circle of his arms, the silence was absolute. My eyes grew heavy, the exhaustion of the flight and the fear finally dragging me under. As I drifted into the space between waking and dreaming, I felt his body relax against mine, his heartbeat slowing to match my own. "Finally," he whispered into the darkness, a sound so soft I almost thought I imagined it. Chapter 6. Tangled. Waking up was a slow, confused ascent from a depth of sleep I hadn't touched in years. Usually, morning meant a jarring return to anxiety, the immediate, frantic checklist of survival. Was I hidden? Was I warm? Was I alone? But today, the alarm bells in my head were silent. I was warm, impossibly, luxuriously warm, and the scent filling my nose wasn't the stale cold of the cabin, but cedar, musk, and the deep, rich smell of a forest after rain. I burrowed deeper into the source of the heat, my cheek rubbing against rough wool, my arm draped heavily over something solid that rose and fell in a slow, rhythmic cadence. It took my sleep-fogged brain a long moment to realize that the pillow under my head was a shoulder, and the iron band across my waist was an arm. I froze, my eyes snapping open to the soft grey light of morning filtering through the frosted window. I was tangled with Malachi. At some point in the night, the polite distance we had started with had dissolved completely. We were not merely sharing a bed, we were woven together. My leg was thrown over his thigh, my face buried in the crook of his neck, and he was holding me with a possessive grip that suggested he had no intention of ever letting go. I should have panicked. I should have scrambled backward, apologizing for the invasion of space, but my body refused to move. It felt right. It felt inevitable. Being held by him didn't feel like being trapped. It felt like being anchored. The storm outside had broken, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt holy, and in that quiet, I could hear the steady, powerful thrum of his heart against my ear. He was awake. I could feel the change in his breathing, the slight shift in tension as he became aware of my consciousness. He didn't pull away or make a joke to break the intimacy. Instead, his hand, which had been resting on the small of my back, moved slowly up my spine, tracing the line of my vertebrae with a reverence that made me shiver. He shifted, turning his head so his lips were dangerously close to my ear. "Do not pull away," he murmured, his voice rough with sleep and thick with something darker. "The fire has died down. You will get cold." It was a command, but it was wrapped in velvet. He wasn't ordering me to stay for his sake. He was giving me permission to take what I needed from him. Eventually, the demands of the day forced us apart. He rose first, untangling himself from me with a reluctance that was palpable, and moved to stoke the stove. I watched him, feeling the loss of his heat like a physical ache. When the room had warmed enough to be bearable, I sat up, my hair a disastrous, tangled mane around my face. I reached for my comb, wincing as the teeth caught in a particularly stubborn knot near my temple. My hands were stiff from the cold, clumsy and ineffective. Stop. The word was soft, but it stopped my hand mid-air. Malachi was standing over me, his hand extended. "Give it to me." I hesitated, clutching the cheap plastic comb. "I can do it. It's just tangled." He didn't argue. He gently pried the comb from my fingers, his touch searingly warm against my cold skin. He nudged my shoulder, a silent instruction to turn around. I obeyed, sitting on the edge of the cot with my back to him, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. This was dangerous. In wolf culture, grooming was an act of claiming. It was something mates did, something mothers did for pups. It was a declaration of ownership and care. To let an alpha groom you was to bare your neck to his teeth. But he didn't bite. He began to brush, starting at the very ends of my hair and working his way up with a patience that was agonizingly tender. His hands were large enough to crush stone, yet they moved through the strands like they were handling spun silk. He teased out the knots with gentle, methodical strokes, never pulling, never rushing. I closed my eyes, the sensation of the bristles against my scalp sending waves of pleasure down my spine. It was hypnotizing. With every stroke, he was stripping away layers of my defense, dismantling the walls I had built against the world. I slumped forward slightly, leaning into his touch, surrendering to the care I had been starved of for so long. He finished, smoothing the hair down my back with his palms, his hands lingering on my shoulders. His thumbs found the tension knots at the base of my neck and began to knead them away. "Why did you think you were worthless, Thalia?" he asked quietly, his mouth so close I could feel his breath stirring the hair on my neck. "Who told you that lie?" Chapter 7. The Truth About the Bond. The question hung between us, heavy and demanding, echoing in the sudden silence of the cabin. His thumbs were still working the tension from my neck, their rhythmic pressure the only thing keeping me grounded as my mind scrambled for an answer. The truth was, no one person had told me I was broken. The world had simply shown me, over and over again, in 1,000 small cruelties. I had been the wolf in the corner, the one passed over, the one whose instincts were always a half step out of sync with the pack. I had been told that my hesitation to mate was a defect, that my desire for something more than duty was a symptom of a sickness. I lowered my head, staring at his boots, unable to meet the golden fire of his gaze in the reflection of the window. I felt wrong, I whispered, the admission scraping my throat. When Garrick looked at me, I didn't feel the pull. I didn't feel the heat. I felt cold. I thought it meant I was empty inside, that I was missing the part of the soul that allows us to love. Malachi's hands stopped moving. He gripped my shoulders, not painfully, but with a firmness that brooked no resistance, and turned me around on the cot until I was facing him. He crouched down so that our eyes were level, stripping away the height difference that usually allowed him to loom over me. Now, he was right there, in my space, forcing me to see the absolute certainty etched into his harsh features. He took my hands in his thumbs brushing over my knuckles, grounding me in the present moment. "You are not empty, Thalia. You are vast," he said, his voice low and vibrating with a strange, ancient intensity. "Do you know why the firstborn sleep? We do not slumber because we are tired. We slumber because the world has become noisy and shallow. We wait beneath the ice for a signal that is strong enough to pierce the apathy of centuries. I have slept through wars. I have slept through the rise and fall of human empires. Nothing woke me. Nothing stirred the ice from my veins." He leaned closer, his gaze searching mine, imploring me to understand. 3 weeks ago, in a hall filled with wolves content to settle for mediocrity, you stood up. You looked a king in the face, and you chose yourself. You chose loneliness over a lie. Do you have any idea what that sounded like to me? I shook my head, mute with shock. I had thought my rejection was a moment of weakness, a shameful flight from duty. "It sounded like a thunderclap," he whispered, lifting one of my hands to press it against the center of his chest. Beneath the wool of his sweater and the solid wall of muscle, I could feel the slow, powerful thud of his heart. It beat against my palm like a war drum. That bond you severed? It did not just break. It snapped with enough force to crack the glacier above my head. Your refusal was a beacon, Thalia. You didn't run away from your fate. You summoned it. The air in the room seemed to shift, the molecules realigning around this new truth. I had spent weeks hating myself for that moment in the Great Hall, convinced I had ruined my life. But Malachi was looking at me as if that single act of defiance was the holiest thing he had ever witnessed. He wasn't here because I was a charity case. He was here because I was the match that had reignited his soul. Tears pricked my eyes, hot and sudden, born of a relief so profound it felt like grief. I wasn't broken. I wasn't missing anything. I had just been waiting for a frequency that only he could hear. "You woke me up," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "And I will spend the rest of this life, and the next, proving to you that you were right to wait." He didn't kiss me, though I desperately wanted him to. Instead, he pressed his forehead against mine, breathing in the air between us, sharing the same space, the same heat, the same reality. We stayed like that for a long time, untangling the knots in my spirit, just as he had untangled the knots in my hair. Slowly, the light in the cabin began to change. The grey gloom of the storm lifted, replaced by a brilliant, blinding white. I pulled back slightly to look out the window. The blizzard had broken. The sky was a piercing, cloudless blue, and the sun was reflecting off the fresh snow, turning the world into a field of diamonds. It was a new day, clear and sharp and full of impossible promise. Malachi stood up, pulling me with him. He didn't let go of my hand. He walked to the door and unbolted it, throwing it open to the morning light. The air that rushed in was cold, but it felt clean, cleansing. He turned to me, his silhouette framed by the blinding white of the northern wilds, and extended his hand toward the open expanse. "The path is clear," he said, a small, devastating smile touching his lips. "Pack your things, little wolf. It is time to go home." Chapter 8. Into the wilds. Leaving the cutter's cabin felt like walking away from a shell I had outgrown. For weeks, those 4 timber walls had been the only thing standing between me and oblivion. A tiny, freezing box where I had planned to disappear. Now, as I pulled the door shut and latched it for the final time, I felt a strange pang of gratitude mixed with relief. I wasn't leaving behind a home. I was leaving behind the woman who had been too afraid to exist. I turned to face the forest, blinking against the blinding glare of the sun reflecting off the pristine, untouched snow. The world looked new, washed clean by the storm, but it also looked impossible. The drifts were mountainous, banking high against the trees, a white ocean that would swallow me whole if I tried to wade through it. I took a single step off the porch and immediately sank to my thigh. The cold bit through my denim instantly, shocking a gasp out of me. I struggled to pull my leg free, panic flaring in my chest as I realized the sheer physical impossibility of the trek. I was determined not to be a burden, to prove that I could handle myself. But nature had other plans. Before I could even attempt a second step, a shadow fell over me, blocking the harsh sun. Malachi was there, standing on top of the snow crust that held his weight but broke under mine, looking down at me with an expression of amused tenderness. He didn't say a word about my struggle or my lack of preparation. He simply reached down, his hand sliding under my arms, and lifted me out of the drift as easily as if I were a child. "The snow is deep, little wolf," he murmured, his voice rumbling against my chest as he pulled me into his orbit. "And your legs are not made for this terrain. Save your strength. You will need it for what comes next." He shifted his grip, swinging me up into his arms so that I was cradled against his chest, my legs hooked over his arm, my face level with his neck. I instinctively wrapped my arms around his shoulders, burying my nose in the fur collar of his coat to escape the biting wind. It was an intimate, vulnerable position, one that stripped away my autonomy and forced me to rely entirely on his strength. In my old life, this would have been a sign of weakness, a visual confirmation of my inferiority. But here, suspended above the frozen ground in the arms of the Lycan King, it felt like a reprieve. He began to walk, his long, powerful strides eating up the distance that would have taken me hours to traverse. He moved through the forest with a silence that was eerie for a man of his size, navigating the hidden roots and drops with an instinct born of centuries. I rested my head against his shoulder, closing my eyes and listening to the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart. It was a slow, heavy beat, like a war drum echoing in a canyon, a constant reminder of the life force that I had awakened. Being carried by him wasn't just about transport, it was a lesson in trust. I had spent so many years fighting to keep my head above water, kicking and screaming against the current, that I had forgotten what it felt like to float. Malachi was the current now, a force of nature that was moving me exactly where I needed to go, and for the first time, I stopped fighting. I let my muscles relax, melting into his warmth, accepting the shelter of his body against the wind. He tightened his hold in response, a silent acknowledgement of my surrender, his chin brushing the top of my head in a gesture of possessive comfort. We travelled like that for what felt like hours, moving deeper into the heart of the ancient forest. The trees here were different, titans of old growth that scraped the sky, their branches heavy with snow, creating a natural cathedral that filtered the sunlight into shafts of gold and blue. The air tasted cleaner here, sharper, filled with the resinous tang of spruce and the metallic crispness of the cold. It was a place untouched by the politics and pettiness of the southern packs, a sanctuary that felt held in a timeless stasis. Malachi slowed his pace as the ground began to slope upward, his breathing shifting slightly but never labouring, his strength seemingly inexhaustible. We crested a high, rocky ridge, the wind whipping around us with renewed vigour. Malachi stopped, shifting my weight slightly so that I could look out over the expanse before us. I turned my head, opening my eyes, and the breath left my lungs in a rush. Below us lay a valley carved by glaciers, a pristine bowl of white cradled by jagged protective peaks. And in the centre, rising from the stone and ice like a natural extension of the mountain itself, stood the territory of the silent pine lineage. It was wilder, more majestic, and more terrifyingly beautiful than anything I had ever imagined. A hidden kingdom waiting for its queen to return. Malachi pressed a kiss to my temple, his voice rough with pride. "Look, Thalia," he whispered into the wind. "This is not just land. This is the promise I made to the silence." Chapter 9. The Gates of the Citadel. The structure rising from the valley floor was not a castle, nor was it the kind of sprawling, ostentatious estate the southern alphas built to stroke their own egos. The hearthstone was a fortress, carved directly from the living rock of the mountain, a seamless fusion of dark granite and ancient timber that looked as though it had stood since the dawn of time. As Malachi carried me down the winding path toward the massive iron-bound gates, I felt a familiar, suffocating pressure tighten around my throat. This place was magnificent, a testament to a power so old it made my former life feel like a fleeting joke. And I was just a runaway wolf in dirty jeans and a borrowed coat, a smudge of ash about to be dragged into a pristine palace. I buried my face in Malachi's neck, squeezing my eyes shut, waiting for the inevitable challenge, for the guards to demand to know why their king was carrying a stray. But there were no guards. There were no trumpets, no banners, no whispering courtiers lining the walls to judge the new arrival. As we approached the colossal entrance, the heavy timber doors swung inward on silent, well-oiled hinges, pulled by unseen hands, or perhaps simply responding to the proximity of their master. Malachi didn't break his stride. He didn't set me down to walk on my own 2 feet, to prove my worthiness, or bow to the lineage of his house. Instead, he tightened his grip, pulling me higher against his chest as he stepped over the threshold, carrying me into the heart of his sanctuary. The transition was instant. The biting wind and the blinding glare of the snow vanished, replaced by a deep, enveloping warmth and the rich, masculine scent of cedar, stone, and fire. The main hall was a cavernous space, the ceiling lost in shadows high above, supported by pillars of raw stone that were wider than the trees outside. A massive fireplace, large enough to roast a whole stag, dominated the far wall, the flames casting a dancing golden light over the polished stone floor. It was breathtaking, grander than anything I had ever seen. But it was also overwhelmingly empty. There were no trophies on the walls, no portraits of ancestors glaring down in judgment. It felt like a home that had been holding its breath for centuries, waiting for someone to exhale. I looked around, my anxiety spiking. I didn't belong here. This was a place for queens, for legends, for women who knew how to hold their heads high without trembling. I was none of those things. I was a fraud, a mistake, a momentary lapse in judgment that Malachi would surely regret once the snow blindness wore off. "It's too much," I whispered, my voice sounding small and fragile in the vast quiet. "Malachi, I can't. I don't fit here. Look at this place. Look at me. He stopped in the center of the hall, the sound of his boots on the stone fading into silence. He didn't look at the grand architecture or the roaring fire. He looked down at me, his expression tightening with a fierce, protective intensity. You are looking at the stone, Thalia. I am looking at the light. This hall has been a tomb for 500 years. It was cold. It was silent. It was dead. Until you entered it. He shifted me in his arms, his forehead pressing against mine, forcing me to focus on him, to ground myself in his reality. Do not insult the hearthstone by thinking you are not enough for it. The stone does not judge the flower that blooms in its cracks. It is simply grateful for the life. He began to walk again, bypassing the grand staircases and heading toward a set of double doors carved with intricate patterns of wolves and moons. He kicked them open, revealing a room that spanned the entire width of the fortress, with floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the endless white expanse of the valley. In the center of the room sat a bed that looked large enough to sleep a pack, covered in furs and heavy woven blankets. This was the master suite, his private sanctuary, the place where the Lycan King slept. I expected to smell the scent of others, of past lovers or history, but the air was clean, waiting, smelling only of him and the fresh linens. He walked to the edge of the bed and finally, reluctantly, lowered me onto the mattress. The furs were soft beneath my hands, a luxury I couldn't comprehend. Malachi stood over me, his golden eyes sweeping over the room before settling on my face. He reached out, tracing the line of my jaw with his thumb, his touch possessive and tender. I built this room before I went to sleep beneath the ice, he said, his voice dropping to a rough whisper that shivered through me. I built it for a dream I wasn't sure existed. It has never been used, Thalia. The door has never been opened. He leaned down, bracing his hands on the mattress on either side of me, trapping me in his warmth. This room wasn't waiting for a queen. It was waiting for you. Chapter 10. The Silent Elders. The sanctuary of the master suite was a bubble of safety I was terrified to pop, but Malachi insisted that there were others I needed to see. He didn't frame it as a command or a duty. He presented it as a simple reality, guiding me toward the heavy oak doors with a hand resting warm and reassuring against the small of my back. I walked beside him, my legs feeling unsteady, my mind racing through a catalog of potential disasters. In my old life, a pack meeting was a theater of cruelty, a place where hierarchy was enforced with teeth and sneers, and where omegas like me were expected to shrink into the floorboards. I tightened my grip on Malachi's sleeve, bracing myself for the whispers, the judgmental stares, and the inevitable question of why the Lycan King had dragged a stray into his palace. We moved through the stone corridors of the Hearthstone, passing archways that looked out over the frozen valley, until Malachi stopped before a set of double doors that stood slightly ajar. The scent drifting from the room beyond was not the musk of aggression or the sharp tang of anxiety I was used to. It was the smell of old parchment, dry tea leaves, and the deep, resinous aroma of burning cedar. Malachi pushed the doors open and ushered me inside, his body angling slightly to shield me from the initial view, a protective instinct that made my heart ache. The room was a library, a cavernous space lined with books that reached the high, vaulted ceiling, warmed by a fire that crackled softly in the grate. But it wasn't the books that froze the breath in my lungs. It was the people standing in the center of the room. There were only 6 of them, but their presence filled the space like a rising tide. These were not the young, posturing wolves of the southern territories who fought for scraps of power. These were the silent elders, the members of the silent pine lineage who had chosen to retreat from the world. They were ancient, their faces mapped with the lines of centuries, their eyes holding a stillness that was both terrifying and peaceful. They stood in a loose circle, wearing simple robes of grey wool, looking less like warriors and more like mountains that had decided to take human form. When we entered, every head turned toward us in unison. I flinched, instinctively taking a half step behind Malachi, waiting for the challenge. I waited for them to ask who I was, to demand my lineage, to scoff at my worn clothes and my obvious fear. But the challenge never came. Instead, a silence descended that was heavier than the stone walls around us. It wasn't a hostile silence. It was a hush of absolute, stunning reverence. The elders looked at Malachi, their eyes widening slightly, as if they were seeing a ghost return to flesh. And then their gazes shifted to me. I held my breath, my heart hammering against my ribs, preparing for the rejection. But then, slowly, impossibly, the tallest of them, a woman with hair like spun silver and eyes that looked like winter skies, lowered her head. She bowed. It wasn't a mock courtesy, it was a deep, respectful inclination of her neck, a gesture of submission from a powerful elder to a frightened girl. One by one, the others followed suit, the rustle of their robes the only sound in the room. They weren't looking at me with judgment. They were looking at me with awe. Malachi's hand tightened on my waist, pulling me gently from his shadow to stand beside him. He wasn't hiding me. He was presenting me. He was showing them the reason his heart had started beating again. I looked up at him, bewildered, and saw a fierce, quiet pride burning in his golden eyes. He nodded to the silver-haired woman, a silent permission to speak. She stepped forward, her movements fluid and graceful despite her age, and stopped a few feet away from us. Up close, I could see the moisture gathering in her pale eyes, the trembling of her hands clasped before her. She didn't smell like a threat. She smelled like lavender and dust, like a grandmother who had waited too long for a letter that never came. She reached out, not to touch me, but as if she wanted to verify that I was real, that I wasn't a hallucination conjured by the snow. Her voice, when she spoke, was a rasp of pure emotion that tore through my defenses and left me standing raw and open before them. "We watched the ice for 500 years, she whispered, her gaze locking onto mine with a terrifying intensity. We watched him turn to stone, his heart slowing, until we thought the silence would claim him forever. We did not think he would ever wake, no matter how much we prayed. You are not just his mate, child. You are his miracle." Chapter 11. Water and Ash. The heavy oak doors of the library closed behind us, sealing away the hushed reverence of the elders, but the weight of their words still clung to my skin like a second layer of clothing. Miracle. The word echoed in my mind, discordant and strange. I was no miracle. I was a runaway, with dirt under my fingernails and the stale scent of fear clinging to my hair. I felt grimy, unworthy of the pristine stone halls and the ancient, holy gaze of the people who lived here. Malachi seemed to sense my spiraling panic, the way my breath had become shallow and quick. He didn't speak, didn't offer empty platitudes. Instead, he led me deeper into the private sanctuary of the master suite, guiding me toward an archway I hadn't noticed before. Beyond the arch lay a bathing chamber that looked less like a room and more like a temple dedicated to water. The air here was warm and humid, smelling of crushed lavender and mineral-rich steam. In the center of the room sat a tub, carved from a single block of dark grey granite, large enough to hold a small ocean. Steam curled off the surface of the water, twisting into shapes that danced in the low light of the iron lanterns. Malachi moved to the edge of the basin, rolling the sleeves of his black sweater up to his elbows, revealing the thick, corded muscles of his forearms. He tested the water with a concentrated frown, adjusting a brass tap until the temperature met some internal standard of perfection. He was tending to me again, performing the duties of a servant with the natural authority of a king, and the disparity made my chest ache. "Get in," he said softly, turning his back to give me a semblance of privacy. "Wash away the cold, Thalia. Wash away the road." I stripped off my dirty clothes with trembling hands, holding them into a pile that looked pathetic against the smooth stone floor. I felt exposed, not just physically but spiritually, as if the layers I was peeling away were the only things holding me together. I stepped into the water, sinking down until the heat swallowed me whole. It was glorious and overwhelming, stinging my frozen skin before settling into a deep, bone-melting comfort. I closed my eyes, letting my head rest against the rim of the stone, wishing I could dissolve into the steam and simply cease to be a problem to be solved. A splash of water disrupted my thoughts. I opened my eyes to see Malachi kneeling beside the tub. He hadn't left. He had picked up a large natural sponge and a bar of soap that smelled of cedarwood. He wasn't looking at my body with lust, though the heat in his eyes was undeniable. He was looking at me with a focused determination to care for me. He reached out, the sponge heavy with warm water, and began to wash my arm. His touch was firm, methodical, scrubbing away the grime of the cutter's cabin, the soot of the wood stove, and the lingering scent of my own fear. "You are thinking too loud," he murmured, moving the sponge to my shoulder. "I can hear your mind tearing itself apart. Stop it." "They bowed to me, Malachi," I whispered, the water lapping against my collarbone. "They looked at me like I was something precious. If they knew I was just a reject who ran away because she was scared." "If they knew," he interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, "they would bow lower." He dropped the sponge into the water and reached for my hand, turning it over to expose the pale skin of my wrist. "They see what I see. They see the strength it took to leave. They see the fire that survived the ice." As he spoke, my gaze fell on his arm, wet and glistening in the lantern light. For the first time, I noticed the scars. They were faint, silver lines running parallel up his forearm, marks of claws that had struck deep and hard centuries ago. There were others, too, burn marks, jagged tears on his knuckles. He was a creature of myth, yes, but he was also a creature of flesh and blood, who had bled and healed and bled again. He wasn't a perfect, untouchable statue. He was a map of survival, just like me. I reached out, my wet fingers tracing the longest scar on his forearm. He went still, his muscles bunching under my touch. "You have ghosts too," I said softly. "We all have ghosts, Thalia," he rasped, turning his hand to interlace his fingers with mine, his grip tightening until it bordered on painful. "The difference is that mine have been cold for a very long time. You are the first warm thing I have touched in 500 years." He leaned forward, ignoring the water soaking into his clothes, and pressed his forehead against my wet shoulder. His breath shuddered out of him, a broken sound that shattered his composure. It wasn't the sound of a king. It was the sound of a starving man finally sitting at a feast. The vibration of his voice travelled through my skin, anchoring me to the earth, to the water, to him. "Do not hide from me," he whispered against my skin, fierce and desperate. "I can see your soul, Thalia. It is the only thing in this world I want to look at." Chapter 12. The flight risk. The intimacy of the bath had stripped me bare, in every sense of the word, leaving me feeling raw and exposed long after I was dry and dressed in the soft, oversized woolen tunic Malachi had provided. He had left me alone in the master suite to rest, closing the heavy doors with a promise to return with food. But the silence he left behind did not bring peace. Instead, it brought the creeping, insidious voice of my own insecurity. I paced the room, the plush rugs swallowing the sound of my bare feet, my eyes darting from the roaring fire to the massive bed that looked like a throne. This was all too much. The castle, the bowing elders, the way Malachi looked at me as if I were a deity he had resurrected. It was a fairy tale that was destined to rot. I was waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the moment he realised I was just a quiet, frightened girl with nothing to offer a king but baggage. Panic began to rise in my chest like a dark tide. It wasn't the panic of danger, it was the panic of unworthiness. I felt like an imposter who had snuck into a sanctuary she didn't deserve. How long until he saw the cracks in my foundation? How long until the novelty of my rejection wore off and he saw the dull reality underneath? I couldn't stay and watch that happen. I couldn't bear to see the adoration in his golden eyes turn to disappointment, or worse, pity. It was better to leave now, while the memory was still perfect, than to stay and ruin it. My flight instinct, honed by years of surviving in a pack that didn't want me, kicked into overdrive. I didn't think, I just reacted. I grabbed my old, worn boots from beside the fire, shoving my feet into them with frantic haste, not bothering with laces. I found my coat, still damp but serviceable, and threw it over the beautiful tunic. I moved toward the door, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I would go back to the cutter's cabin. I would figure something out. Maybe I would keep walking north until I fell off the edge of the map. Anything was better than the excruciating vulnerability of being loved by a creature so far above me. I eased the heavy door open, wincing as the hinges gave a soft groan, and slipped into the corridor. The stone hallway was dim and quiet, stretching away into the shadows. I took a step, then another, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I was doing it. I was escaping. I was safe from the terrifying possibility of happiness. I turned the corner toward the main staircase, my eyes fixed on the distant promise of the front gates, and slammed straight into a wall of solid muscle. I gasped, stumbling back, but hands shot out to steady me. Large, warm hands that gripped my upper arms with a familiarity that made my knees weak. I looked up, dread pooling in my stomach, and found Malachi standing there. He wasn't angry. He didn't look like a jailer catching a prisoner. He looked devastated. He was holding a tray of food, bread, cheese, a steaming mug of something rich, and for a moment he just stared at me, his gaze dropping to my boots, my coat, the desperate set of my shoulders. The tray rattled slightly in his hands before he set it down on a nearby stone table with a slow, deliberate movement, as if he needed to free his hands to keep the world from ending. "You are leaving," he stated, his voice flat, devoid of the warmth that had been there only an hour ago. It wasn't a question. It was a confirmation of his worst fear. "I can't do this, Malachi," I choked out. stepping back, putting distance between us. "I don't belong here. You have this kingdom, and these people who look at you like a god. And I'm just me. I'm a mess. I'm scared all the time. You think I'm some brave rebel because I ran away, but I'm not. I'm a coward. And eventually you're going to see that, and I can't be here when you do." He didn't move to stop me physically. He didn't block the path. He stood there, looking at me with eyes that were suddenly dark with pain. A centuries-old agony that I had reawakened. He looked less like a king and more like a man watching his lifeline act to cut itself. The silence stretched between us, agonizing and thick. I expected him to argue, to tell me I was being ridiculous, to order me back to the room. But when he spoke, his voice was a broken whisper that tore through me more effectively than any shout. "I waited 500 years for a heartbeat that matched mine," he said, taking a single, hesitant step toward me, his hands open at his sides in a gesture of utter surrender. "I woke up because you called me. I brought you here because I thought I could finally rest. Tell me, Thalia, have I failed you?" Chapter 13. The Kneeling. The question hung in the stagnant air of the corridor, heavy and suffocating. Have I failed you? It was the last thing I expected him to ask. I had expected anger, annoyance, perhaps even a cold dismissal of my childish attempt to flee. But this raw, bleeding vulnerability was something I had no defense against. I looked at the most powerful creature in the Northern Hemisphere, a man who could crush armies with a sweep of his hand, and saw him looking at me as if I held the knife that was currently carving out his heart. My hands shook where they gripped the rough wool of my coat, the urge to run warring violently with the sudden crushing weight of my own guilt. I wasn't saving him from my inadequacy. I was breaking him with my fear. "No," I whispered, the words scraping my throat. "You haven't failed. I told you, Malachi. It's me. I'm the one who can't do this. I'm the one who isn't royal. You need a queen, someone who knows how to rule, not a runaway who panics because the room is too nice." I took a step back, my back hitting the cold stone wall, feeling trapped by his devastating sadness. "Please, just let me go before I disappoint you." He didn't answer immediately. He moved toward me, closing the distance with slow, deliberate strides. I flinched, instinctively bracing for him to grab my arm, to physically restrain me, to use his superior strength to force me back into the gilded cage. But he didn't reach for me. When he was mere inches away, close enough that I could smell the spice of his skin and the heat of his distress, he did the unthinkable. He didn't tower over me. He sank. The sound of his heavy knees hitting the stone floor echoed through the hallway like a gavel strike. I gasped, my hands flying to my mouth, paralyzed by the sight. Malachi, the Firstborn, the Lycan King, was on his knees at my feet. He had lowered himself so completely that I was now looking down at him, forcing a perspective shift that made the world spin. He bowed his head, exposing the vulnerable curve of his neck, the kill spot, in a display of absolute, terrifying submission. It wasn't a mockery. It wasn't a trick. It was a physical manifestation of the power dynamic he had been trying to explain to me since the moment he knocked on my cabin door. He was stripping himself of his height, his strength, and his rank, placing himself entirely at my mercy. "Get up!" I cried, reaching down to grab his shoulders, my fingers digging into the hard muscle. I tried to pull him up, but he was immovable, rooted to the spot like the mountain itself. Malachi, please, get up. You can't do this. You're the king. Anyone could see you. Let them see, he said, his voice a low rumble against my stomach as he looked up. His hands came up to wrap around my waist, not to trap me, but to anchor himself to me. Let them see where the true power lies. You think you are small, Thalia. You think you are weak. You have brought a monster to his knees without striking a single blow. There is no authority in this world higher than that. He rested his forehead against my stomach, his grip tightening as he breathed me in. The heat of him soaked through my clothes, branding me. I stopped trying to pull him up. My hands went to his hair, my fingers tangling in the dark strands, holding him there as the panic in my chest began to unravel, replaced by a profound, shaking awe. He wasn't keeping me here to be his ornament. He was keeping me here because I was his center of gravity. Without me, he would spin off into the void. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I wasn't the imposter. I was the engine. He pulled back just enough to look me in the eye, craning his neck to meet my gaze. The gold in his irises was burning with a fierce, possessive resolve. I am not asking you to rule a kingdom, Thalia. I am asking you to rule me. He took one of my hands from his hair and pressed a kiss to the center of my palm, his lips moving against my skin as he spoke the words that would bind me to him forever. You are the queen. I am just the sword arm. Command me to leave, and I will vanish into the snow. But do not leave because you think you are less. You are everything. Chapter 14. The Scenting. The sight of Malachi on his knees shattered the last remnant of my resistance, breaking the cage I had built around my heart more effectively than any force could have. I looked at the vast, powerful expanse of his shoulders, bowed in submission to a girl who was afraid of her own shadow, and I finally understood. He wasn't trying to trap me. He was offering me the keys to the kingdom. The fear that had been driving me toward the door evaporated, replaced by a surge of emotion so fierce it knocked the breath from my lungs. I couldn't stand above him. I couldn't look down on the man who had waited centuries for me. I dropped to the stone floor, ignoring the jarring impact on my knees, and crashed into him, wrapping my arms around his neck and burying my face in the curve of his shoulder. He caught me instantly, his arms locking around me like bands of iron, pulling me so close that I couldn't tell where my heartbeat ended and his began. We stayed like that for a long moment, tangled together on the cold floor of the hallway, breathing in the jagged, desperate rhythm of two souls, realizing they had almost lost each other. I pressed my lips to the pulse point on his neck, tasting the salt of his skin and the wild, heady flavor of his power. He groaned, a low vibration that rumbled through his chest and straight into my core. And then he began to move. He didn't kiss me, not yet. Instead, he began to scent me. It was a primal, purely instinctual act that bypassed my human logic and spoke directly to the wolf curled in my soul. Malachi rubbed his cheek against my jawline, the rough stubble grazing my skin, before burying his nose in the sensitive hollow behind my ear. He inhaled deeply, dragging the scent of me into his lungs, and then exhaled his own essence onto my skin. He was marking me. He was overriding the lingering smells of the road, of fear, of my old life, and replacing them with the heavy, possessive signature of the Lycan King. It was intoxicating. Every brush of his face against my neck sent shivers of pleasure racing down my spine, igniting a heat in my belly that spread outward like wildfire. I wasn't just being claimed. I was being woven into him. I tilted my head back, baring my throat to him in an offer of absolute trust, my fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of his neck to hold him closer. He took the invitation, his lips grazing the sensitive skin of my throat, his teeth scraping lightly over the pulse that hammered there. It wasn't painful. It was a promise. He was mapping the territory he intended to rule, and for the first time in my life, I wanted to be conquered. I wanted his scent in my pores, his weight on my body, his name etched into the marrow of my bones. I whimpered, a soft, needy sound that seemed to snap the last thread of his restraint. He pulled back just enough to look at me, his golden eyes blown wide, the pupils dilated until they nearly swallowed the iris. "You smell like winter and surrender," he rasped, his voice rough with a hunger that had been denied for too long. He lifted one hand to cup my face, his thumb tracing my lower lip, dragging it down slightly. "Do you feel it, Thalia? The pull? It is not just the bond. It is the recognition that we are made of the same stardust." "I feel it," I whispered, leaning into his palm, closing my eyes against the intensity of his gaze. "I don't want to run anymore. I want to stay. I want to be yours." The words acted like a catalyst. Malachi surged to his feet, we people me up into his arms in one fluid motion, as if gravity had no hold on us. I wrapped my legs around his waist, clinging to him, desperate to maintain the contact. He didn't head back toward the library or the bathing chamber. He turned toward the double doors of the master suite, his strides long and purposeful. The tenderness was still there, but it was now underscored by a fierce, undeniable urgency. We had danced around the fire for long enough. It was time to step into the flames. He kicked the bedroom door shut behind us, sealing out the world, the elders, and the past. He walked to the edge of the massive bed and looked down at me, his expression savage and tender all at once. "No more running, Thalia," he said, his voice dropping to a dark velvet command that made my toes curl. "Tonight, the bond settles." Chapter 15. The Unraveling. Malachi lowered me onto the furs of the massive bed, following me down instantly so that his weight pressed me into the mattress. The sensation of him covering me was a revelation, a heavy, grounding blanket of heat and muscle that finally quieted the last lingering whispers of my anxiety. He hovered above me, bracing himself on his forearms to keep from crushing me, his golden eyes scanning my face with a hunger that was terrifying in its intensity. But beneath the hunger lay a profound reverence, a hesitation that spoke of centuries of waiting. He reached out, his fingers trembling slightly, and traced the line of my jaw, his touch feather-light against my skin. It was a silent question, a final opportunity for me to retreat, to ask for space, to slow down. I didn't want to slow down. I reached up, my hands finding the hem of his black sweater, and pulled. He understood immediately, sitting back on his heels to strip the garment off in one fluid motion. When he looked at me again, bare-chested in the firelight, the breath left my lungs. He was magnificent, a landscape of hard plains and shifting shadows, marked by the silver history of his past battles. I sat up, my hands finding his chest, my palms flattening against the solid wall of muscle over his heart. It beat against my skin like a trapped bird, frantic and fast, betraying the calm mask of his face. I leaned forward and pressed a kiss to the center of his chest, right over that thundering rhythm. He inhaled sharply, a ragged sound that tore through the quiet room, and his hands came up to cup my face, tilting my head back until our eyes locked. "You are the end of my winter," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He leaned in, capturing my lips in a kiss that was slow, deep, and utterly consuming. It wasn't the frantic, desperate claiming of a boy. It was the deliberate, savoring possession of a king who knew he had all the time in the world. His mouth moved against mine with a skill that made my head spin, tasting me, learning me, pouring 500 years of loneliness into me and asking me to fill the void. I opened for him, wrapping my arms around his neck, pulling him closer until there was no air left between us. The kiss deepened, sparking a fire in my blood that spread to every extremity, melting my bones until I felt liquid and pliable in his hands. He laid me back against the pillows, his hands roaming over my body with a possessive reverence. He touched me as if I were made of something holy, worshipping the curve of my hip, the dip of my waist, the soft skin of my inner thigh. With every touch, he murmured praises against my skin, words in an ancient tongue that I didn't understand but felt in my soul. He told me I was beautiful, that I was strong, that I was worthy of the sun and the moon and the stars. He was rewriting the narrative of my life with his hands and his mouth, erasing the years of neglect and replacing them with a blinding, undeniable adoration. I felt the walls around my heart crumbling, brick by brick, until there was nothing left but raw, exposed need. When we finally joined, it was a collision of souls as much as bodies. The sensation was overwhelming, a feeling of fullness, of completion, of a missing piece finally snapping into place. I gasped, arching against him, and he froze, his eyes locked on mine, waiting for me to adjust, to accept him. "Look at me, Thalia," he commanded, his voice a guttural growl. "Watch me love you." And I did. I watched the way his face contorted with pleasure, the way the golden fire in his eyes burned brighter as we moved together. It was a slow, rhythmic unraveling of everything we had been before. I wasn't just Thalia the runaway, and he wasn't just Malachi the myth. We were two halves of a whole, finally merging into one. As the crest of the wave approached, the bond between us flared to life, a tangible, golden cord connecting my heart to his. It pulsed with light and heat, flooding my mind with his emotions, his fierce protectiveness, his overwhelming relief, his bottomless love. I cried out as the pleasure shattered me, clinging to his shoulders as he followed me over the edge, his roar of satisfaction echoing through the room. In the aftermath, as we lay tangled together in the cooling sheets, breathless and slick with sweat, he shifted slightly. He pressed his face into the curve of my neck, his teeth grazing the sensitive skin where the mating mark belonged. "Do you feel it?" he murmured against my pulse, his voice heavy with sleep and satisfaction. "The earth knows you now. You are no longer a guest here, my queen. You are part of the stone." Chapter 16. Morning in the Citadel. Sunlight poured into the room, not the gray, filtered light of the storm, but a brilliant golden torrent that promised a new season. I woke slowly, drifting up from a sleep so deep it felt medicinal, my body heavy and languid in the aftermath of the night. For a moment, disoriented by the warmth and the softness of the furs beneath me, I reached out for the familiar cold of the cabin wall. Instead, my hand encountered warm, solid skin. The memory of the night before rushed back in a flood of heat and sensory details. The firelight on his skin, the weight of his body, the way he had looked at me when the bond finally snapped into place. I opened my eyes to find Malachi propped up on one elbow, watching me. He wasn't sleeping. He looked as though he had been awake for hours, content simply to catalogue my breathing. "Good morning, wife," he rumbled, his voice rough with morning sleep and a deep, satisfied possessiveness. The word wife sent a thrill racing down my spine, replacing any lingering anxiety with a giddy, terrifying joy. I wasn't just his mate in the biological sense. I was his chosen partner, the woman he had claimed in the eyes of his ancestors and the earth itself. I smiled, stretching luxuriously under the heavy blankets, feeling the new ache in my muscles. A good ache, a reminder of how thoroughly I had been loved. Malachi tracked the movement with hungry eyes, his hand reaching out to trace the mating mark he had left on my shoulder. It was tender to the touch, a raised claim that throbbed in time with his own heartbeat, a permanent tether connecting us across any distance. "I didn't think morning could look like this," I admitted, my voice husky. "I thought I'd wake up and find out it was a fever dream, that I was still freezing in the cutter's shack." "Never again," he promised, leaning down to press a kiss to my forehead. "The cold is behind you, Thalia. From now on, you will only know warmth." He sat up, the furs falling away to reveal his chest, and reached for a tray sitting on the bedside table. I hadn't even smelled the food over the scent of him, sandalwood, musk and sex. But now the aroma of fresh bread, roasted meat and strong tea filled the air. He set the tray between us, tearing off a piece of warm bread and offering it to me. It was a domestic scene, simple and quiet, yet it felt more intimate than the wildest passion. Here was the Lycan King, a creature of myth, breaking bread with me in our bed, his hair tousled, his guard completely down. I took the bread, my fingers brushing his, and felt the spark of the bond flare, a constant humming reassurance that I was not alone. We ate in a comfortable silence, sharing the food and the quiet morning. I found myself laughing as he clumsily tried to wipe a crumb from my chin, his large fingers gentle but uncoordinated in his eagerness. The sound of my own laughter startled me. It was light, free, a sound I hadn't made in years. Malachi froze, his hand still on my cheek, and looked at me with an expression of pure wonder. "Do that again," he whispered. "The sound. It is better than music." I laughed again, purely because he asked, and he smiled, a genuine, heart-stopping smile that transformed his harsh face into something devastatingly beautiful. In that moment, surrounded by sunlight and crumbs, I realized that I wasn't just safe. I was happy. The heavy cloak of unworthiness I had worn for so long had dissolved in the night, burned away by the fire of his love. But the world outside the citadel had not vanished, even if we had ignored it. As we finished our meal, a soft knock echoed on the heavy double doors. Malachi's face instantly hardened, the lover vanishing behind the mask of the king. He pulled the sheet up to cover me, a protective reflex, before calling out, "Enter." The door opened just wide enough for Sola, the silver-haired elder, to slip in. She didn't look at me with judgment, only a knowing warmth, but her expression was serious as she approached the bed. In her hand, she held a rolled parchment sealed with red wax, the color of blood, the color of a challenge. "Forgive the intrusion, my king," she said, her voice low. "But a messenger bird arrived from the southern border. It bears the seal of the Blood Moon Pack." The air in the room instantly turned ice cold. I froze, the blood draining from my face. Garrick. He had found me. The peace of the morning shattered like glass. Malachi took the scroll, his hand trembling with suppressed rage, but he didn't open it. He looked at me, seeing the return of the fear in my eyes, and his expression softened into a fierce, deadly resolve. He held the scroll out, not to read it, but to offer me a choice. "He demands to know where you are," Malachi said, his voice a low growl that vibrated with the promise of violence. "He thinks you are lost. He thinks you are property to be recovered." He placed the unopened scroll in my lap. "Tell me what to do, Thalia. Do we answer him, or do we show him that he is shouting into the void?" Chapter 17. The Reply. The red wax seal on the parchment glared up at me like a fresh wound, a harsh, violent blemish against the pristine white of the furs. In another life, seeing that crest, the mark of the alpha who had tried to break me, would have sent me spiraling into a panic attack, frantically searching for a place to hide. But as I traced the rim of the seal with my thumb, I realized with a sudden calm clarity that my hands were not shaking. The fear that had defined my existence for so long was simply gone. It had been burned away in the heat of the night, replaced by the unshakable foundation of the bond that now hummed beneath my skin. I looked at Malachi, who was watching me with a stillness that bordered on predatory, ready to tear the world apart if I gave the signal. He wasn't waiting to see if I would crumble. He was waiting to see how I would rise. I stood up, letting the heavy furs pool around my waist before clutching the oversized tunic closer to my body. I didn't open the scroll. I didn't need to read the threats, the demands, or the false concern of a man who viewed me as a piece of misplaced inventory. Giving his words attention gave them power, and Garrick deserved neither. I walked to the massive stone fireplace where the logs were crackling merrily, the heat flushing my cheeks. I held the parchment over the flames for a heartbeat, watching the firelight dance across the paper. And then I dropped it. It fell into the heart of the blaze, the paper curling and blackening instantly, the red wax melting like blood before vanishing into smoke. There was no ceremony, no grand speech, just the quiet, absolute destruction of the last tether holding me to a life that was no longer mine. I turned back to Malachi, dusting my hands off as if I had just disposed of something dirty. "He doesn't get a reply," I said, my voice steady and clear in the large room. "He doesn't get to know where I am. He doesn't get to know that I'm happy. To him, I'm just gone, like a ghost he couldn't catch." Malachi rose from the bed, a slow, fluid movement of pure power, and crossed the room to me. He didn't say a word. He simply wrapped his arms around me, pulling me back against his chest until I was enveloped in his heat. He buried his face in my hair, inhaling deeply, and I felt the rumble of his approval vibrate through his chest and into my back. It wasn't just pride. It was a profound, settling peace. He knew, just as I did, that by burning that letter, I hadn't just ignored a summons. I had declared a sovereign independence. I leaned back into him, resting my head on his shoulder, looking at the ashes in the grate. The past was smoke. The future was the man holding me. "Come," he murmured against my ear, his breath warm and tantalizing. "There is something you need to see. The elders know, but the land needs to know." He led me not to the door, but to the large glass doors that opened onto the private balcony of the master suite. He opened them to the biting chill of the morning, but this time I didn't flinch. I walked out into the cold, protected by the heat of his body and the fire in my own blood. We stood on the stone ledge, high above the valley floor, looking out over the breathtaking expanse of the silent pine lineage. The sun was fully risen now, turning the snow-covered peaks into blinding shards of gold and white. Below us, the ancient forest stretched out like a green ocean dusted with sugar, silent and majestic and enduring. It was a world untouched by the pettiness of the south, a kingdom that had waited for its rulers to wake up. As we stood there, a low, haunting sound began to rise from the valley floor. It started as a single note, deep and mournful, then was joined by another and another, until the air itself seemed to vibrate with the song. It was the pack, the silent elders, and the few guardians who watched the borders, howling. But it wasn't a howl of war or warning. It was a song of welcome, a harmonious, spine-tingling melody that acknowledged the return of the king and the arrival of his queen. I felt the sound resonate in my marrow, calling to the wolf inside me, who threw back her head and howled in spirit along with them. I was home. I wasn't hiding in the woods anymore. I was ruling them. Malachi tightened his arms around my waist, resting his chin on top of my head as we looked out over our dominion. The wind whipped my hair around us, but in the circle of his arms, everything was still. I thought of Garrick, furious and searching in the dark, chasing a shadow that had long since outgrown him. I thought of the girl who had shivered in the cutter's cabin, terrified of her own worth. She felt like a stranger now. "Let them howl in the dark," Malachi whispered against my ear, his voice rough with a love that felt eternal, binding us to the mountain, the snow, and each other. Let them search the world for what they lost. They will never find you here, Thalia. I have the moon right here in my arms. And that is where we leave Malachi and Thalia, standing on the edge of the world, ruling the silence together. I hope the warmth of their fire reached you, wherever you are tonight. If this story melted the ice around your heart, please give this video a like. It helps our library grow more than you know. Make sure you are subscribed with the notification bell turned on so you never miss a release. I want to hear from you in the comments. What was the moment that made you fall for the Lycan King? Was it when he brushed her hair? Or when he fell to his knees? Let me know your favorite scene and tell me where in the world you are listening from. Now, take a deep breath, because next time we are trading the silence of the snow for the chaos of a nursery. Imagine an alpha king who has conquered nations, crushed rebellions, and ruled with an iron fist, but is currently losing a war against his own grieving, screaming 4-year-old heir. Every nanny has quit. Every expert has failed. The king is at his breaking point, desperate enough to try anything, even if it means calling back the quiet girl he fired 3 months ago because she was too soft for the palace. But when she steps through the door, the screaming stops, and the Alpha King realizes that the woman he rejected might be the only person on earth who can save his son. And him. Get ready for no one could calm the Alpha King's stubborn child until the Omega maid they rejected came in. I'll see you in the nursery.